In this video, we're going to populate the country-state drop-down list. On the form for our shipping address, we need to populate the drop-down list for countries and also populate the drop-down list for states. So what we'll do is we'll populate the countries and states from the backend REST API. We'll pull information from the database. The user will select the country, and then depending on the country selected, we'll populate the list of states. Now, the term state is different for each country. So in the US, we make use of states, but I know in other parts of the world or in other countries, they have other names like province, districts, regions, prefecture, so on. So basically, whatever administrative region it's used for your country, simply use that name. But I'll simply use state here just to keep things simple. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and look at our development process. And this is for the back-end development. The first thing that we'll do is we'll create the database tables, and then we'll develop the JPA entities for country and state. Next, we'll create the Spring Data REST repositories. And then finally, we'll update our Spring Data REST configs. Alrighty, step one of creating the database tables. So here we'll have two tables. We'll have a country table and a state table. So for country, we'll have the ID, the code, and the name. For state, we'll have the ID name and the country ID. So the country ID maps back to the actual country. So basically, many states will belong to one country, and one country has many states. And the nice thing here is that we can make use of some of these advanced mappings, one to many and many to one. And we'll be able to pull this together in our e-commerce application. Alrighty, so here's the SQL for creating those tables. So we create the table country. We have the columns ID, code, and name. We specify that ID is the primary key. And then we also create the table for state, ID, name, country ID. So country ID is actually a foreign key. And that country ID maps back to the actual ID column of the country table. All right, so let's go ahead and insert data into our database. So we'll insert some data into the country table. So we'll insert data for Brazil, Canada, Germany, India, Turkey, and the United States. The values here are ID, code, and name. And you may wonder, why only 6 countries? As you know, there are more countries in the world. Well, at the moment, these are the 6 countries that our fictional company, Love to Shop, can actually ship products to. Of course, we're just making this up, but we're a small startup, and hopefully in the future, our company will expand and we'll be able to ship to more countries in the future. Now, this is just a little classroom example. Feel free to add more countries to the database. It's totally up to you. And we'll do a similar thing here for states. So when you enter a state, you're entering the states for a given country. And so the values here are the ID, comma, name, and the given country ID. So at the top, we have the country ID of 1, that's for Brazil. And then down here at the bottom, we have the country ID of 4, that's for India. And once we actually run the real SQL, you'll see all the data and how everything maps up. So you'll get access to all of these files. Now, once everything is populated, then we can actually do some queries on the data. So I can do a select star from country, get all the countries that are available. And then here I could say select star from state where country ID equals 4. And so that'll give me a list of all of the states for India. Okay, now step 2 of developing the JPA entities for country and state. So we have our country entity. This is all fairly straightforward. You've seen this before. We define our fields here for ID, code, and name. We set up the mappings for the appropriate database columns. And then we also do a similar thing here for a state. We make use of the fields and also the columns. And then notice here at the bottom, we have our advanced mapping relationships here, one to many. So one country has many states. And then over on the right-hand side for state, many states belong to one country. All right, so we have the one to many and the many to one for this JPA entity mapping relationship. And so now in step 3, we're going to create our Spring Data REST repositories. So here's our interface. Country repository extends JPA repository. And remember here, we give the actual entity class, comma, the primary key type. So here our entity is country. The primary key type is integer. And then we make use of this repository REST resource. We customize it by saying path equals countries. And so this will expose a /countries endpoint for this given Spring Data REST repository. And so now to retrieve all countries, we simply go to localhost 8080 /API/countries, and that'll give us a list of all the countries for this given app. And then also to retrieve country ID equal 4, we go to localhost 8080 /API/countries /4. Alrighty, so let's look at the JSON output for these REST APIs. So here to retrieve all countries, then I'll see my JSON here at the bottom. So for the countries Brazil and Canada. And then to retrieve a country ID equals 4, then I can see the output here, and this will give me the actual country for India. And we'll run examples of this when we actually get our API up and running. Now let's do a similar thing here for states. So we set up our interface state repository extends JPA repository state, integer. This exposes a /states endpoint. And so then I can get a list of all the states by going to API/states. But we'd probably want to kind of customize this a bit because I don't want all the states. I only want states for a given country. So I want to find by country code. So give me the states for a given country. So here I have find by country code at param code, and then I pass in a parameter string code. So this will give me the states by the given country code that I pass in. So here's an example here. I have /search /find by country code, code equals IN, that's for India. And I can do a similar thing here for code equals US, that's for the United States. So this will only give me states for that specific country code. And this will work out great for us in our user interface because once the user selects a given country in the user interface, then we want to populate the drop-down list with the states for that given country code. Alrighty, so here's a quick example as far as the JSON output. So if I country code equals IN for India, then I'll get all the states for India. A similar thing here, code equals US, I get all the states for the US. And again, we'll kind of pull this all together. Once we get the back end up and running, then we'll hook it into the front end for our user interface that's running in Angular. Then the last step here is updating the Spring Data REST configs. So we're going to update our coding for our myDataRESTconfig.java. We're going to make the APIs for /country and /state, make it read-only, because this is reference data. There's no real need to change it via the REST API. So we'll simply disable the HTTP methods for put, post, etc. I'll actually get into the coding details of this in the next video, so it'll be easier for us to just walk through the code in our IDE. Alrighty, this is good stuff. Let's go ahead and move to the next video and let's start writing some code.